Just minutes before divorce, wife arrives in a limousine with triplets. Husband panicked. Mistress abandons him. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. I know some of you feel my introductions are getting too familiar, and that's okay. I hear you with love. I never speak just to speak. I speak to connect, to comfort, to care. So today, no long talk, just a soft prayer from my heart to yours. May peace flow through your soul like gentle water. May the weight you carry feel lighter today, even just a little. May love find its way back to you, quietly, unexpectedly. I pray your hidden pain is touched by healing and your silent hopes are answered with beautiful surprises. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are loved in more ways than you can imagine. Now, family, please don't leave this story halfway. It was written with love, with emotion, and with you in mind. And today, I kindly ask something new. When the story ends, please rate it out of 10 in the comments. Be honest, be real. Your voice guides me, and if you don't rate it, well, I'll mind, truly. Because I care what you think. I care about you. Like the video, leave a kind comment, share it with someone you care about. Let's keep this family growing, strong, faithful, and filled with love. Let's begin. With all my love, always.
The diamond bracelet fell from Steve's jacket pocket like a glittering accusation, hitting the marble floor of their penthouse with a sound that shattered Jean Cooper Hicks's world. She stared at the delicate piece of jewelry sprawled at her feet, her 5 months pregnant belly making it impossible to bend down and examine it closely. But she didn't need to. The bracelet was exquisite, white gold with tiny diamonds that caught the lamplight like captured stars. It was also exactly the kind of gift Steve would choose for a woman he was trying to impress. A woman who wasn't his wife. No, Jean whispered to the empty penthouse, her hands instinctively moving to protect the 3 daughters growing inside her. No, no, no. But even as she spoke the denial, her brilliant, analytical mind, the same mind that had built a $50 million investment portfolio from nothing, was already connecting the dots she'd been desperately ignoring for months. The late nights that had become later, the business trips that seemed to multiply, the way Steve's eyes no longer lit up when he looked at her swollen form, the way his hands had stopped reaching for her in bed. John Cooper Hicks had built her career on reading market patterns, on seeing the truth behind carefully constructed financial facades. Now, standing in the living room of their $4 million Chicago penthouse, she realized she'd been willfully blind to the most important pattern of her life. Her husband was cheating on her. The thought hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over as much as her pregnancy would allow. 5 years of marriage, 2 years of fertility struggles, the joy when they'd finally conceived triplets through IVF. All of it lies. All of it while he was with someone else. "Steve," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty apartment. No answer. He was supposed to be home by now, was supposed to help her with the nursery furniture that had been delivered today. Instead, he'd texted an hour ago, "Running late, don't wait up." Running late. With her. Jean bent as much as her belly would allow and picked up the bracelet. It was warm from being in Steve's pocket, warm from being close to his treacherous heart. The price tag was still attached, a tiny thing tucked discreetly inside the clasp. $8,000, more than they'd spent on John's engagement ring all those years ago when they were young and broke, and so desperately in love that money didn't matter. $8,000 for another woman while his pregnant wife wore the same 3 maternity dresses in rotation because he'd said they needed to watch spending with the babies coming. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Jean sank into the Italian leather chair, another symbol of their success, and examined the bracelet more closely. No engraving, but then Steve was too smart for that. No, this was the kind of gift you gave to a woman you were still trying to win over, still trying to impress. which meant this affair was either very new or very serious. Her phone buzzed. A text from Steve. Client dinner running long. Home late. Love you. Love you. The words that used to make her heart flutter now felt like acid in her chest. With shaking fingers, Jane opened her laptop, the same laptop where she managed portfolios worth millions, where she'd built her reputation as one of Chicago's most successful investment analysts. If she could spot a fraudulent company from their financial statements, she could damn well uncover her husband's lies. She started with their credit card statements. Steve handled most of their finances, claiming it was easier since he understood the legal side of their business arrangements. She'd been happy to let him, trusting him completely. Now she realized that trust had been her first mistake. The patterns emerged quickly once she knew what to look for. Charges at expensive restaurants during times when Steve claimed to be working alone. Hotel bills for weekends when he'd said he was at legal conferences. Jewelry purchases she'd never seen. Lingerie from boutiques she'd never visited. Each discovery pierced her heart, but Jean's analytical training overrode her emotions. She needed facts, proof, the full scope of his betrayal. The devastating blow came at 11:47 p.m., an email Steve forgot to delete from their shared cloud storage, a sonogram image, not their triplets. This showed a single baby, dated 2 weeks ago. His mistress was pregnant too. Jean's water glass slipped from numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a pattern that reminded her horribly of the bracelet's scattered diamonds. The sound jolted her back to the moment, to the reality of what she'd discovered. Steve wasn't just having an affair. He was building another family. While she carried his triplets, suffered through morning sickness and bed rest, and the constant worry that came with a high-risk pregnancy, he was creating the same situation with another woman. The front door opened with the soft whisper of expensive hinges. "Jean, you still awake?" Steve's voice carried the false cheer of a man with a guilty conscience. She heard his footsteps approaching, the familiar sound of his Italian leather shoes on their marble foyer. In 30 seconds, he would walk into this room and see her holding the evidence of his betrayal. In 30 seconds, their marriage would officially be over. John made a decision that would change everything. She slipped the bracelet into her pocket and quickly closed her laptop. When Steve appeared in the doorway, tall, handsome, looking every inch the successful corporate lawyer in his $1,000 suit, she was sitting calmly in her chair, hands folded over her belly. "There you are," he said, crossing to kiss her forehead. The same lips that had been kissing another woman. "How are my girls doing tonight?" "We're fine," Jean said, her voice steady despite the hurricane raging inside her chest. "All 4 of us are just fine." Steve smiled, the same charming smile that had won her heart 7 years ago. "Good. I'm exhausted. Mind if I grab a shower?" "Of course not. Take your time." As Steve disappeared toward their bedroom, Jean remained in her chair, one hand on her belly where their daughters moved restlessly, as if sensing their mother's distress. The other hand fingered the bracelet in her pocket, $8,000 worth of evidence. She had a choice to make. She could confront Steve now, demand the truth, fight for their marriage like the passionate woman she'd always been. Or she could do what she did best, analyze, strategize, and build an airtight case before making her move. One of the babies kicked hard against her ribs, as if urging her toward action. "You're right, sweetheart," John whispered. "Mama needs to be smart about this. Mama needs to protect you." For the first time since finding the bracelet, Jean smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the cold, calculating smile of a woman who'd built million-dollar portfolios by outthinking her competition. Steve had made one critical error. He'd betrayed an investment analyst, a woman trained to spot lies, uncover hidden assets, and predict market crashes before they happened. He had no idea what was coming for him. As the sound of running water came from their ensuite bathroom, Jeanne opened her laptop again and began what would become the most important investigation of her career. The investigation that would destroy Steve Hicks completely. Chapter 2. The Analyst's Mind. 4 months. Jean had exactly 4 months between discovering Steve's betrayal and her delivery date to build the most important case of her life. Not a financial portfolio this time, a survival strategy. She treated his deception like a hostile corporate takeover. He was attempting to acquire her life, her children, and her assets while disposing of her efficiently. But Steve had miscalculated. He'd chosen to betray a woman whose career was built on exposing financial frauds. For 16 weeks, Jeanne watched her husband leave with kisses and promises to take care of his girls. Each morning she smiled and waved from their bedroom window as his BMW disappeared. Once alone, she began her real work. The first rule of investigating financial fraud was to follow the money. Steve might be a brilliant lawyer, but he was careless with digital footprints. June had discovered this weakness years ago when she'd helped him organize their taxes, but back then she'd found it endearing. Her absent-minded professor husband who could negotiate million-dollar mergers, but forgot to delete his browser history. Now that carelessness was going to destroy him. "Show me what you're hiding, you bastard," John whispered to her laptop screen as she pulled up Steve's credit card statements for the 15th time. She was curled up in their home office, her massive belly making it impossible to sit in chairs normally. The room was Steve's domain, mahogany furniture, legal awards lining the walls, photos of them from happier times, scattered across his desk, like evidence of a life that no longer existed. The financial evidence painted a picture of systematic deception that took her breath away. The affair hadn't started 6 months ago as she'd initially thought. It had been going on for over a year. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, even a weekend getaway to Napa Valley during a time when Steve had supposedly been in Cleveland for a deposition. Jean cross-referenced every suspicious charge with Steve's work calendar, his travel schedules, even his gym membership records. The pattern emerged like a connect-the-dots puzzle drawn in betrayal. Thursday dinners at Romano's, their anniversary restaurant. Weekend trips to the Four Seasons. Charges at La Perla Lingerie Boutique on dates that corresponded with Steve's working late excuses. But the financial evidence was just the foundation. Jean's real expertise lay in reading between the lines, in spotting the subtle indicators that revealed deeper corruption. And what she found in Steve's communications made her blood run cold. The first devastating discovery came from Steve's deleted email folder, which he'd apparently forgotten to empty. Draft emails to his law partner, Daniel Morrison, discussing contingency plans for custody arrangements and documenting concerning behavioral patterns. Her hands shook reading his clinical assessment of her supposed mental state. Jean has been increasingly emotional and irrational since the pregnancy. Crying spells, mood swings, paranoid thoughts about my work schedule. I'm concerned about postpartum psychosis, given her family history. Family history. He was weaponizing her aunt's depression 15 years ago, private pain she'd shared during their engagement. Now he was using that trust to build a case declaring her mentally unfit. The second email draft was worse. "Dan, I need you to recommend a child psychologist who specializes in emergency custody evaluations. Someone who understands that sometimes loving fathers have to make difficult decisions to protect their children from unstable mothers." Jean's vision blurred with rage and heartbreak. Steve wasn't just planning to leave her. He was planning to steal their daughters and paint her as a mentally unstable woman who'd abandoned her children. He was going to take everything, the babies, the assets, the life they'd built together, while positioning himself as the victim of a woman's mental breakdown. The third discovery was a consultation request with Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, a forensic psychologist who specialized in custody evaluations. Steve had scheduled a preliminary meeting for 2 weeks after Jean's due date. The appointment notes, which she found in his cloud storage, outlined his strategy. Wife showing signs of prenatal depression and paranoid ideation. Concerned about her ability to care for multiple infants. May require immediate intervention post-delivery. Every word was a calculated lie, every observation a deliberate distortion of normal pregnancy concerns into evidence of mental instability. But Steve's most chilling preparation was a folder titled Legal Precedents, Emergency Custody, filled with case studies of fathers who'd successfully obtained full custody by proving maternal unfitness. He'd highlighted passages about postpartum psychosis, about women who'd abandoned their children, about fathers who'd heroically stepped in to protect innocent babies from dangerous mothers. He was building a playbook to destroy her. Jean's investigation expanded beyond finances and emails. She installed monitoring software on their home network, tracking every website Steve visited, every app he used, every digital breadcrumb he left behind. The picture that emerged was of a man living a completely double life. The other woman's name was Catalina Morales. 28 years old, a paralegal at Sterling and Associates, a competing law firm that specialized in the same corporate merger work as Steve's practice. She was beautiful in the way that made Jean's pregnancy-swollen body feel grotesque by comparison. Tall, sophisticated, with the kind of effortless elegance that came from youth, and a body unmarked by carrying children. Steve's communications with Catalina revealed the depth of his deception. Text messages that spoke of their future together and plans for after the complications are resolved. Photos of them at restaurants, hotels, even at Catalina's apartment, a sleek downtown loft that Steve had apparently helped her finance. But the most devastating discovery was a voice recording on Steve's phone, apparently left running by accident after a call with Catalina. Jean listened to her husband's voice, the same voice that whispered loving words to her belly each night, discussing their strategy with cold calculation. "She's getting more suspicious," Steve's recorded voice said. "But the timing is perfect. After the birth, when her hormones are all over the place, that's when we make our move. Dr. Hawthorne has already agreed to evaluate her. With the right documentation of erratic behavior, we can have emergency custody within 48 hours. Catalina's voice was equally chilling. And then, what about the babies? They'll be with their father where they belong. You and I can raise them properly, give them the stable home they deserve. Jean will get visitation rights, eventually, once she gets the help she needs. Help she needs. As if loving your husband and trusting him completely was a mental illness requiring treatment. Jean had listened to that recording 17 times, each repetition burning Steve's betrayal deeper into her soul. He wasn't just leaving her, he was orchestrating her complete destruction while positioning himself as the loving father protecting his children from their unstable mother. But Steve had made a fundamental error in his calculations. He'd underestimated the woman he was trying to destroy. John Cooper Hicks hadn't built a $50 million investment portfolio by being a victim. She'd done it by being smarter, more strategic, and more ruthlessly logical than her competition. And now she was about to apply those same skills to the most important battle of her life. Her counter-strategy began with documentation. Every piece of evidence Steve had gathered against her. Jean had 3 pieces of evidence against him. His affair, his financial deceptions, his conspiracy to steal their children, all of it meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and verified through multiple sources. But evidence wasn't enough. Jean needed allies, resources, and a plan that would not only protect her daughters, but completely destroy Steve's ability to hurt any other woman ever again. Her first ally was Helen Morrison, a private investigator who specialized in domestic investigations. Helen was a former federal agent who'd built her reputation helping women gather evidence in high-stakes divorce cases. She was expensive, discreet, and absolutely ruthless when it came to exposing cheating husbands. "I've seen bastards like your husband before," Helen had told her during their first meeting at a coffee shop across town. "They think they're so smart, so careful, but they always leave traces. And honey, your husband left traces everywhere." Helen's investigation had uncovered details that made Jean's stomach turn. Steve's affair with Catalina had begun during a joint case between their firms. He'd pursued her aggressively, promising her partnership opportunities and financial security. But more disturbing was Helen's discovery that Catalina wasn't Steve's first infidelity, just his most serious one. There had been others: a court reporter named Angela, a client's wife named Rebecca, a legal secretary named Maria. All young, all ambitious, all eventually discarded when they became inconvenient. Steve Hicks was a predator who used his position and charm to exploit vulnerable women. And now he was planning to add Jean to his list of victims while stealing their daughters to complete his collection. But Jean had one advantage Steve couldn't account for. She was fighting for her children. And a mother fighting for her babies was the most dangerous opponent he could have chosen. The final piece of her strategy fell into place when Dr. Sarah Chen, her obstetrician, mentioned during a routine appointment that several of her patients had delivered their babies at alternative birthing centers to avoid hospital complications. "Some of my patients prefer the privacy," Dr. Chen had said casually, "especially high-profile couples who want to keep their deliveries out of the media." Privacy. That was exactly what Jean needed. 2 weeks before her due date, as Steve's conspiracy to steal their daughters reached its final stages, Jean made the last preparations for her own plan. She'd built her case, gathered her evidence, and prepared her counterattack. Now it was time to disappear. That night, as Steve slept peacefully beside her, probably dreaming of his future with Catalina and their children, Jana felt the first contraction. It wasn't early labor. It was perfectly timed labor, induced with Dr. Chen's help at a private clinic where Steve would never think to look. "Time to meet your mama properly, my darlings," Jana whispered to her belly as another contraction gripped her. "And time to teach your father that he chose the wrong woman to destroy." The war was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Birth Strategy. The ambulance siren wailed through the Chicago night as Jean Cooper Hicks gripped her mother's hand, her contractions coming fast and hard. But this wasn't the panicked emergency it appeared to be. This was the most carefully orchestrated disappearance of her life. "Remember," Dr. Sarah Chen whispered as she checked Jean's vitals in the back of the ambulance, "you were transferred to Northwestern for complications with the triplets. That's the story everyone will hear." Elena Cooper, Jean's mother, squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. At 65, Elena was still formidable, a retired federal judge who'd spent 30 years protecting victims of domestic violence through the legal system. When Jean had revealed Steve's plan 3 weeks ago, Elena had been the first to suggest what she called the judicial option. "Sometimes the law isn't enough," Elena had said. "Sometimes you have to disappear completely before you can fight back properly." Now, as they raced through the empty streets toward the Serenity Birth Center, a private facility 40 miles outside the city, Jean felt another contraction grip her body like a vice. Pain mixed with determination as she thought about what she was leaving behind. Steve was in New York for a 3-day business conference, believing his pregnant wife was safely at home with morning sickness. He had no idea that the stomach flu Jean had complained about was actually early labor, carefully timed with Dr. Chen's help to coincide with his absence. "He's going to realize something's wrong when he returns from New York," John gasped between contractions. "Let him," Elena replied fiercely. "By then, you'll be safely delivered and we'll control the narrative." The Serenity Birth Center was owned by Dr. Margaret Winters, Elena's former colleague from their domestic violence cases. Margaret had seen too many women lose children to manipulative men who weaponized the legal system. When Elena called in a favor, Margaret didn't hesitate. "We'll deliver your granddaughters safely," Margaret had promised. "Officially, this birth never happened until you're ready." The center was small, discreet, completely off Chicago's medical grid. Women came here needing privacy, celebrities avoiding paparazzi, wives fleeing abusive husbands, anyone requiring temporary invisibility. The staff maintained absolute confidentiality, their records sealed from outside inquiries. As they pulled into the center's circular driveway, Jean felt a moment of pure terror. She was about to give birth to 3 babies while executing the most dangerous gamble of her life. If Steve discovered her location before she was ready, he could have her declared mentally incompetent and seize the babies before she'd even recovered from delivery. But there was no turning back now. "Dr. Cooper Hicks," Margaret greeted them at the entrance, her silver hair gleaming under the soft lights. "Let's bring these babies into the world safely." The delivery room was nothing like the sterile hospital environment Jean had toured during her pregnancy. This felt warm, intimate, like delivering in a friend's beautifully appointed bedroom. Soft music played in the background, and the lighting was gentle enough to feel peaceful while still providing medical functionality. "The contractions are getting stronger," Dr. Chen observed, checking the monitors. "We're looking at delivery within the next few hours." Hours. Jean had hours before Steve woke up and discovered her absence. Hours before her carefully planned deception unraveled, and the real battle began. "I need to call Helen," Jean said, referring to the private investigator who was coordinating the next phase of their plan. Elena already had her phone ready. "Helen's been monitoring Steve's house all night. She'll alert us the moment he discovers you're gone." As another contraction built to its peak, Jean thought about the man sleeping in their bed, the father of the children she was about to deliver. Despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, the calculated cruelty of his plan, part of her still remembered the Steve she'd fallen in love with. The young lawyer who'd worked 18-hour days to build their future, who'd cried with joy when they'd finally gotten pregnant after years of trying. That man was gone now, replaced by someone capable of destroying the mother of his children for his own convenience. But these babies, Lyralai, Emberly, and Thessaly, they deserved better than becoming pawns in their father's sick game. "I can see the first baby," Dr. Chen announced. "Just a few more pushes, Jean." 47 minutes later, at 3:23 a.m., Laralee Cooper entered the world with a cry that sounded like an announcement of war. She was perfect. 6 pounds, 2 ounces of fierce determination, wrapped in the softest skin Jean had ever touched. "Hello, my brave girl," Jean whispered, holding her daughter against her chest. "Mama's here, and Mama's never letting anyone hurt you." Emberly followed 18 minutes later, smaller but with an even stronger voice, as if she was angry about being kept waiting. At 5 pounds, 14 ounces, she made up for her size with sheer volume. "This one's going to be trouble," Margaret laughed, handing the baby to Elena. "Look at that grip." Thessaly, their final daughter, arrived 23 minutes after her sister with the peaceful demeanor of someone who'd waited patiently for her turn. At 6 pounds even, she opened her eyes immediately and seemed to study her mother's face with ancient wisdom. "All 3 girls, all healthy," Dr. Chen announced. "Jean, you did beautifully." But Jean barely heard the praise. She was staring at her daughters, 3 perfect human beings who looked like a combination of her and Steve, innocent of their father's sins, but already threatened by his ambitions. In Steve's plan, these babies were assets to be acquired, not daughters to be protected. He's never getting his hands on you, John promised them. Ever. Elena's phone buzzed at 4:47 p.m. the next day. Helen says Steve's back from New York, she reported. He's discovered Jean's gone and he's calling her phone. On cue, Jean's phone began ringing. Steve's name flashed on the screen along with their wedding photo, an image that now seemed like evidence from a crime scene. "Don't answer," Margaret advised. "Let him panic." The phone rang 4 more times over the next 10 minutes. Then came the text messages. "Jean, where are you? Your mother said you were sick. Please call me back. I'm worried about you and the babies. I'm coming home early. Something's wrong. Call me now or I'm calling the police." The progression from confusion to anger to desperation would have been satisfying if Jean wasn't holding 3 newborn babies who were about to become the center of a custody war. "He's calling Northwestern Hospital," Elena reported, monitoring Helen's updates. "He's telling them his wife disappeared and he's worried about pregnancy complications." This was the crucial moment. Steve would discover that Northwestern had no record of Jane being admitted. He'd call other hospitals, growing more frantic with each dead end. But he'd never think to look at private birthing centers, especially not one 40 miles outside the city. "How long do we have?" John asked, adjusting Lyra Lay's blanket while Emberly nursed hungrily. "Helen estimates 6 to 8 hours before he thinks to expand his search beyond medical facilities," Elena replied. "But we should move to the safe house as soon as you're medically cleared." The safe house was a property Elena had purchased through a shell corporation 5 years ago, originally intended as a retirement home, but now serving as their fortress. It was registered under a false name, equipped with security systems, and completely invisible to anyone searching for Jean Cooper Hicks. "I need to document everything," Jean said, reaching for the camera Elena had brought. "Birth certificates, medical records, photos, everything that proves these babies are mine and that I'm competent to care for them." Over the next 3 hours, as Jean recovered and nursed her daughters, Elena and Margaret worked to create an official record of the birth that would protect the babies legally while keeping their location secret. The birth certificates listed Elena's address as Jean's residence, establishing a legal foundation for her disappearance. At 8:15 a.m., Helen called with an update that made everyone's blood run cold. "Steve's at the police station," she reported. "He's filing a missing persons report and demanding an immediate welfare check on you and the babies. He's claiming you've been showing signs of mental instability and might have hurt yourself or the children." It had begun. Steve was executing his plan to paint Jean as mentally unstable, but now he had to do it without evidence of actual harm to sell his story. "He's also called Catalina," Helen continued. "She's on her way to the police station to provide supporting testimony about your supposed erratic behavior." Jean felt a surge of pure fury. Steve was enlisting his pregnant mistress to help destroy the mother of his children. The cruelty was breathtaking. "Let them come," Elena said grimly. "We have something better than testimony. We have the truth." By 10:30 a.m., as Chicago buzzed with the news of a prominent lawyer's missing pregnant wife, Jean was safely ensconced in the safe house with her 3 daughters. The nursery Elena had prepared was perfect: 3 cribs, a changing station, and every piece of equipment 3 newborns could need. "This is your first home, my darlings," Jean whispered to her daughters as she fed Thessaly. "It's not much, but it's safe. And Mama's going to make sure you stay safe until we can go home properly." Outside, Helen's surveillance team monitored Steve's increasingly desperate search. He'd expanded beyond hospitals to include clinics, birthing centers, even morgues. His calm facade was cracking as the reality of his situation sank in. Without Jean and the babies, he had no leverage, no evidence of mental instability. No heroic father narrative, just a man whose pregnant wife had vanished, leaving him to explain to police, media, and his law partners why the mother of his children would disappear rather than trust him with their safety. He's made his first major mistake, Elena observed, watching the news coverage on her tablet. He's gone public too quickly. Now everyone's asking why a loving husband's wife would run away from him. The narrative was already shifting. Social media buzzed with speculation about what kind of man drives his pregnant wife to disappear. Steve's law firm issued a statement requesting privacy, but the damage was spreading. Phase 1 complete, John said, looking down at Lorelei, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. Your daddy has no idea where we are, and the whole world is starting to ask the right questions. But this was just the beginning. Steve would regroup, hire better investigators, pressure Jean's family and friends. He'd escalate his claims about her mental state and demand police intervention. Jean was ready for all of it. She'd spent 3 months building an airtight case against Steve while he'd built a house of lies against her. Now she had 3 perfect daughters as motivation and a mother who understood how to fight dirty in the legal system. Rest while you can, girls, Jean whispered to her sleeping babies, because Mama's about to teach your father what happens when you try to destroy the wrong woman. The war had officially begun. Chapter 4. Underground Mother. 4 weeks into her underground life, John Cooper Hicks had developed a routine that would have seemed impossible during her pampered penthouse existence. She woke at 5:30 a.m. when Thessaly stirred for her first feeding, then moved through careful choreography, caring for 3 infants while building the legal case that would destroy their father. The safe house Elena had chosen was a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet suburb 40 miles from Chicago, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and newcomers were simply nodded at politely. To the neighbors, Jean was Jennifer Collins, a single mother recovering from a difficult divorce, staying with her mother while she got back on her feet. The deception was easier than she'd expected. Motherhood had changed her appearance dramatically. Her body was softer, her face rounder from breastfeeding, her hair longer and usually pulled back in a messy ponytail. Without designer clothes and professional makeup, she looked like an entirely different person from the polished investment analyst who'd once graced the society pages with Steve. But while her appearance had softened, her mind had sharpened to a razor's edge. Lyra lay, sweetheart, you need to let Mama work for 20 minutes, Jean whispered to her most demanding daughter, who'd developed an uncanny ability to start crying the moment Jean opened her laptop. We're building a case against your daddy, and Mama needs to concentrate. Lyra Lay, now 3 weeks old, responded with a piercing wail that woke both her sisters. Within seconds, the peaceful morning had dissolved into a symphony of infant demands. This was the reality Steve could never understand, that caring for triplets wasn't just about love and cuddles. It was about military-level logistics and superhuman endurance. While he'd been planning to steal these babies as trophies for his new life with Catalina, Jean was living the exhausting truth of what raising them actually required. I've got Emberly, Elena announced, appearing in the doorway with the efficiency of a woman who'd raised her own children while building a judicial career. You take Thessaly and keep working. Helen's calling in an hour with updates. Elena had adapted to grandmother duty with systematic efficiency. She'd created feeding schedules, sleep rotations, and labor division that allowed Jean to function on minimal sleep while maintaining her investigation into Steve's crimes. Because that's what this had become, not just a custody battle, but a criminal investigation. The evidence Jean had uncovered in her 4 months of preparation was damning enough to destroy Steve's reputation. But the evidence that had emerged during her 4 weeks underground was career-ending and potentially criminal. Helen Morrison, their private investigator, had exceeded every expectation. While Steve's hired investigators searched hospitals, police stations, and Jean's known associates, Helen had been systematically dismantling his entire life. "Your husband is incredibly stupid for such a smart man," Helen had reported during their first encrypted video call after John's disappearance. "He's been using the same email password for 7 years. His credit cards are linked to cloud storage he's never secured, and he apparently thinks deleting text messages actually makes them disappear." Helen's investigation had revealed the full scope of Steve's deception. The affair with Catalina wasn't just personal, it was professional fraud. Steve had been sharing confidential client information with Catalina's firm, essentially engaging in corporate espionage. He'd used inside knowledge from his own clients to help Sterling and associates win competing bids, then received kickbacks through consulting fees paid to shell companies. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. "Look at this," John murmured to Thessaly, who was nursing peacefully while her mother reviewed Helen's latest report. "Your daddy didn't just cheat on Mama. He's been stealing from his clients for over a year." The pattern was clear once Helen had connected the dots. Steve's expensive gifts to Catalina, the luxury apartment he'd helped her finance, even his own increased spending, it was all funded through elaborate billing fraud. He'd been charging clients for work never performed, creating false consulting fees, and even inflating court costs to skim money off the top. "He's been building a nest egg for his new life," Elena observed, reading over Jean's shoulder. "All of it stolen from the people who trusted him." But the most devastating discovery was what Helen called the pattern. Catalina wasn't Steve's first affair. She was simply his most elaborate one. Over the past 5 years, Helen had documented at least 6 other relationships, each following the same progression. Steve would identify a vulnerable woman in his professional circle, pursue her aggressively with expensive gifts and promises of a future together, then discard her when she became inconvenient. Angela Rodriguez, the court reporter, discarded when she started asking about his marriage. Rebecca Walsh, a client's wife, discarded when her divorce was finalized, and she expected Steve to leave John. Maria Santos, a legal secretary, discarded when she got pregnant and demanded he divorce his wife. Pregnant. Helen's investigation had uncovered that Maria Santos had been pregnant with Steve's child 2 years ago. She'd miscarried after Steve cut off all contact and had her fired from the law firm where she'd worked. "He's done this before," Jean realized, her blood running cold as she read Maria's statement. "He destroys pregnant women as a hobby." Maria had been willing to give Helen a detailed account of Steve's behavior once she learned about John's situation. The pattern was identical: passionate pursuit, expensive gifts, promises of a future together, then systematic destruction when the woman became pregnant and threatened his carefully constructed life. "He told me his wife was mentally unstable," Maria had told Helen. "Said she was paranoid and jealous, that she'd never give him children. When I got pregnant, he said it was perfect, that we could be together and raise the baby properly. Then he just vanished. Changed his number, had security escort me out of the building. I lost the baby 2 weeks later from the stress." Steve Hicks wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a predator who used pregnancy as a weapon against the women he claimed to love. The realization made Jean hold Thessaly closer, made her look at Lyra Leigh and Emberly with new understanding of what they'd escaped. In Steve's world, these beautiful babies weren't daughters to be cherished. They were leverage to be wielded against their mother. "Helen's found 2 more women," Elena reported, ending a phone call. "Similar patterns, similar destruction. One of them is willing to testify." Testify. They were building more than a custody case now. They were building a criminal case that would put Steve behind bars for fraud, harassment, and potentially accessory to Maria's miscarriage if the district attorney was interested in pursuing charges. But first, they had to survive Steve's escalating campaign to find them. He's hired Blackstone Investigations, Helen had warned during their last conversation. They're expensive and ruthless, former FBI agents who specialize in finding people who don't want to be found. Blackstone's involvement meant Steve was serious about locating John before she could organize an effective defense. It also meant he had access to resources that shouldn't be available to a private citizen. Database searches, surveillance technology, even police contacts who might be willing to share information informally. He's also petitioned for emergency custody, Elena added, reviewing legal documents on her tablet. Claims you're mentally unstable and may have harmed the children. Judge Morrison granted a hearing for next week. Judge Morrison, no relation to Elena despite the name, was known for his conservative views on family matters and his tendency to favor fathers in custody disputes. Steve had chosen his forum carefully. "Can we fight it remotely?" Gian asked, shifting Thessaly to her shoulder for burping. "Not without revealing your location. If we don't appear, he gets default custody. If we do appear, we lose the advantage of controlling when and how this battle happens." It was a perfect trap. Steve was forcing Jean to choose between protecting her daughters and fighting for her legal rights. He expected her to panic, to make desperate mistakes that would prove his claims about her mental state. But Steve had made a fundamental error in his calculation. He'd assumed Jean would react emotionally to his legal maneuvers, the way his previous victims had reacted when he destroyed their lives. He didn't understand that Jean Cooper Hicks had spent 3 weeks planning her counterattack while caring for 3 newborns on minimal sleep. If she could manage triplets and build a federal case simultaneously, she could certainly outmaneuver one narcissistic lawyer and his corrupt legal strategy. "We're not fighting this custody hearing," John announced, making a decision that surprised even Elena. "We're going to let him win it." "John, think about it, Mama. Steve wants emergency custody based on claims that I'm mentally unstable and may have hurt the babies. But what happens when he gets custody and there are no babies to take?" Elena's eyes widened as she understood Jean's strategy. "He'll have to admit to the court that he doesn't know where his children are," Elena said slowly. "He'll have to explain why his wife would take their babies and disappear rather than trust him with their safety." "Exactly. And while he's trying to explain that to a judge, we'll be presenting our evidence to federal prosecutors who are very interested in white-collar crime and systematic fraud." It was a dangerous gamble. By allowing Steve to win the custody hearing, Jean would technically be in violation of a court order, but she'd also be forcing him to explain to the world why the mother of his children had chosen to become a fugitive rather than trust the legal system to protect them. "The media coverage alone will destroy him," Elena realized. "Even if he eventually gets the children back, his reputation will be ruined." "But we're not giving him the children back," John said quietly, looking down at Thessaly's peaceful face. "Because by the time this is over, Steve Hicks will be in federal prison, and these babies will never have to see their father again." The plan was audacious, risky, and completely dependent on staying hidden until they were ready to strike. But it had one advantage that Steve's plan lacked. It was built on truth instead of lies. Over the next hour, as Lyra Lai and Emberly napped, and Thessaly studied her mother's face with serious dark eyes, Gina put the finishing touches on what she privately called Project Nuclear Option. Phase 1 had been her disappearance, successful. Phase 2 was Steve's legal victory, about to begin. Phase 3 would be his complete destruction, coming soon. "Tell Mama a secret, Thessaly," Jean whispered to her youngest daughter. "Do you think Daddy's going to enjoy being famous for all the wrong reasons?" Thessaly responded with what might have been a smile or might have been gas, but John chose to interpret it as approval. In 1 week, Steve would stand in a courtroom and receive legal custody of 3 children he couldn't produce. The victory would be the beginning of his destruction, and the world would finally see the real Steve Hicks. Not the charming lawyer with the perfect family, but the predator who'd driven the mother of his children into hiding rather than trust him with their safety. It was going to be beautiful. Chapter 5. The Mistress Awakens. Catalina Morales had always prided herself on being the other woman men left their wives for, not the kind of woman men eventually left. At 28, she possessed the kind of sophisticated beauty that made married men rethink their commitments. Tall, elegant, with dark hair that fell in perfect waves and a smile that promised adventure beyond the mundane realities of marriage and children. But sitting in Steve Hicks's downtown Chicago office at 2:17 a.m., watching him pace behind his mahogany desk like a caged animal, Catalina was beginning to understand that she might have misjudged everything about their relationship. 3 weeks, Steve muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. 3 goddamn weeks, and those investigators have found nothing. How does a woman 8 months pregnant with triplets just vanish? Catalina watched her lover, the man she'd been sleeping with for over a year, the man who'd promised her a future once his complicated marriage situation was resolved, and felt the first real stirring of doubt since their affair began. The Steve she'd fallen for had been confident, charming, completely in control of every situation. He'd pursued her with the focused intensity of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it. When he'd told her his marriage was a mistake, that Jean was mentally unstable and paranoid, that he was only staying with her until after the babies were born to ensure their safety, Catalina had believed him completely. After all, why would he lie? But this man pacing his office in a wrinkled shirt and 2-day stubble wasn't the controlled corporate lawyer she'd fallen in love with. This man was unraveling, and his desperation was starting to smell like fear. "Steve," she said carefully, "maybe we should consider that Jean might have had a good reason to disappear." He stopped pacing and turned to her with an expression that made her instinctively lean back in her chair. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I mean," Catalina continued, trying to keep her voice steady, "what if she found out about us? What if she's scared about what happens to her and the babies after the divorce?" Steve's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Jean doesn't have the intelligence or the resources to disappear this completely. She's always been dependent on me for everything, financially, emotionally, even socially. Without me, she's nothing." The casual cruelty in his voice hit Catalina like a physical blow. In all their months together, Steve had never spoken about Jean with such vicious contempt. He'd always portrayed his wife as troubled but sympathetic, someone who needed help rather than someone who deserved destruction. "But she built her own career," Catalina pointed out. "Her investment firm is incredibly successful. She's not exactly helpless." "Her investment firm?" Steve's voice carried an edge that made Catalina's skin crawl. "Catalina, sweetheart, Jean works for other people. She analyzes portfolios and makes recommendations. She doesn't have the kind of money or connections it would take to disappear 3 newborn babies without a trace." There was something in the way he said "sweetheart" that felt condescending rather than affectionate. Catalina had heard that tone before, during her marriage to her ex-husband, right before he'd explained why her opinions didn't matter and her concerns weren't valid. "The police think she might have had help," Catalina said, testing his reaction. Steve's face darkened. "The police think a lot of things, most of them useless." He moved to his desk and pulled out a thick folder, spreading photographs across the surface like playing cards. Catalina recognized them as surveillance photos from the private investigators Steve had hired. Images of hospitals, airports, bus stations, any place a woman might go with 3 newborn babies. But mixed in with the legitimate investigation photos were others that made Catalina's stomach turn. Pictures of Jean during her pregnancy, obviously taken without her knowledge. Photos of her entering doctor's appointments, shopping for baby clothes, even images of her at their home, visible through windows. "Steve," Catalina whispered, staring at the invasive photographs. "When were these taken?" "Does it matter?" he replied, not looking up from the pictures. "I needed to document her erratic behavior for the custody proceedings. These look like stalking photos." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Steve slowly raised his eyes to meet hers, and for a moment, Catalina saw something in his expression that made her blood freeze. It wasn't love or concern or even anger. It was the cold calculation of a predator who'd been caught showing his true nature. "Catalina," he said quietly, "I think the stress of this situation is making you paranoid. Maybe you should go home and get some rest." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a dismissal, delivered in the same tone she'd heard him use with opposing counsel when he was done negotiating. Catalina gathered her purse and coat, her mind racing. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Of course you will," Steve replied, already turning back to his photographs. "Drive safely." The dismissal was so casual, so confident, that Catalina felt something cold settle in her chest as she walked to her car. For the first time in over a year, she wondered if Steve saw her as anything more than a convenience he was planning to discard when she outlived her usefulness. The thought followed her during the 20-minute drive to her downtown loft, a sleek space in a converted warehouse that Steve had helped her finance. At the time, his assistance had felt romantic, a successful man taking care of his woman. Now she wondered if it was simply another form of control. Once inside her apartment, Catalina poured herself a glass of wine and tried to process what she'd seen in Steve's office. The photographs, his casual cruelty when discussing Jean, the way he'd dismissed her concerns. None of it matched the man she thought she knew. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, and almost without thinking, Catalina found herself typing "Stephen Hicks, Chicago lawyer" into the search bar. The results were dominated by recent news stories about Jane's disappearance, but scrolling deeper revealed something that made Catalina's wine glass slip from numb fingers. A Chicago Tribune article from 3 years ago. Local lawyer's ex-girlfriend dies in apparent suicide. Rebecca Walsh, 26 years old, found dead from prescription overdose. The article mentioned her tumultuous relationship with a prominent attorney who wasn't named for privacy reasons, but the comments section revealed the truth. Everyone knows it was Steve Hicks. He destroyed that poor girl. Rebecca wasn't suicidal until he finished with her. He follows the same playbook. Someone should warn his current wife. Catalina's hands shook as she searched for more information. Rebecca Walsh had been a client of Steve's during her divorce proceedings. The relationship had begun professionally, then become personal. According to online rumors and social media posts from Rebecca's friends, Steve had promised to leave his wife once Rebecca's divorce was finalized. Instead, he'd cut off all contact immediately after her divorce was complete. Rebecca had tried to reach him for months, becoming increasingly desperate as she realized she'd been used. Friends described her as broken and completely destroyed by Steve's abandonment. 3 weeks after Steve stopped returning her calls, Rebecca Walsh was found dead. Catalina's research grew more frantic as she discovered more pieces of a pattern she'd been too infatuated to see. Social media posts from other women, all following similar timelines. Professional relationships that became personal, expensive gifts and promises of a future together. Then sudden, complete abandonment when the women became inconvenient. Angela Rodriguez, a court reporter who'd posted about a narcissistic lawyer who'd pursued her aggressively, then disappeared when she started asking about his marriage. Maria Santos, whose LinkedIn profile mentioned being terminated due to false accusations from her position at a law firm. Her few public posts hinted at a relationship with a married colleague that had ended badly when she'd gotten pregnant. A pattern. Steve Hicks had a pattern of pursuing vulnerable women, making them believe they were special, then discarding them when they became inconvenient. And some of those women had been completely destroyed by the experience. Catalina's phone buzzed with a text from Steve. "Thinking about you. Can't wait to start our real life together once this mess is resolved." The message that would have made her heart flutter 6 hours ago now made her sick to her stomach. She was pregnant with Steve's child, just like Maria Santos had been. She was inconvenient, just like all the others had eventually become. And if Steve's pattern held true, she was next to be discarded. But Catalina Morales hadn't clawed her way from a working-class background to a successful career by being naive about men's motivations. She'd survived one bad marriage and several toxic relationships by learning to recognize the warning signs of dangerous men. She'd just been too blinded by Steve's charm and financial security to see what he really was. Now, sitting in the apartment he'd helped her afford, carrying the child he'd claimed he wanted, Catalina realized she had a choice to make. She could continue playing the role of the devoted mistress, waiting for Steve to destroy her the way he destroyed the others, or she could fight back. Her phone rang. Unknown number, but something made her answer. "Ms. Morales, this is Helen Morrison, a private investigator. I'm calling because you're in danger." Catalina's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ms. Morales, I know you're involved with Stephen Hicks, and I know you're pregnant with his child. I also know you're not the first woman to find herself in this position with him. What do you want?" "I want to offer you a way out," Helen said quietly, "before you end up like the others, before he destroys you and your baby." Catalina closed her eyes, thinking about Rebecca Walsh's obituary, about Maria Santos's termination, about her own precarious position as the pregnant mistress of a man who just shown her his true nature. "I'm listening," she whispered. "Good," Helen replied, "because Steve Hicks is about to learn what happens when you try to destroy the wrong woman. And you can either help us stop him, or you can become his next victim." The choice was easier than Catalina had expected. "Tell me what you need me to do." 2 hours later, as dawn broke over Chicago, Catalina Morales made the decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to be another victim in Steve Hicks's pattern of destruction. She was going to help bring him down. And maybe, in the process, she could save herself and her unborn child from becoming the latest casualties in Steve's war against the women who trusted him. The mistress had awakened to the truth. Now it was time for revenge. Chapter 6. Evidence Mountain. The war room Elena had created in the basement looked like a criminal investigation headquarters. 3 wall-mounted monitors displayed Steve's financial records, communication logs, and surveillance footage. Whiteboards covered in connecting lines linked names, dates, and crimes in a web that would make prosecutors weep with joy. But the most devastating material sat in a simple manila folder labeled Steve's Greatest Hits, testimonies from 6 women whose lives Steve Hicks had systematically destroyed over 8 years. Jian sat in front of the monitors at 3 a.m., nursing Emberly while reviewing the latest additions to their case. 4 weeks of investigation had transformed her initial adultery discovery into a case involving fraud, harassment, and what Detective Torres from Chicago PD's white-collar unit called systematic criminal behavior with federal implications. "Helen's outdone herself," Elena murmured, reviewing printed emails on her tablet. "Catalina's cooperation has opened doors we never could have accessed otherwise." The decision to bring Catalina into their investigation had been risky, but Helen Morrison had proven once again why she was Chicago's most successful private investigator. Instead of viewing Catalina as an enemy, Helen had recognized her as Steve's next intended victim and turned her into their most valuable asset. "Look at this," John said, pointing to a series of bank transfers on the screen. Steve's been moving money to offshore accounts for 6 months. He wasn't just planning to steal the babies, he was planning to disappear with Catalina and leave me with nothing. The financial evidence was staggering. Steve had systematically looted their joint accounts, their business investments, even Jean's retirement funds. He'd created shell companies, false consulting agreements, and elaborate money laundering schemes that would have left Jean financially destroyed even if she'd won the custody battle. But Steve's financial crimes were secondary to the criminal conspiracy Helen had uncovered with Catalina's help. Catalina recorded their conversation last night, Elena reported, putting in earbuds to listen to the latest evidence. Steve's getting desperate. He's talking about hiring more aggressive investigators to find you. More aggressive. Helen had warned them that Steve was moving beyond legal investigation methods. The private security firm he'd hired was known for operating in legal gray areas, surveillance that bordered on stalking, background checks that involved illegal database access, even intimidation tactics designed to pressure witnesses into silence. He's also pressuring the judge for an emergency hearing, Elena continued. Claims you might have hurt the babies and fled the country. Judge Morrison's emergency custody order had been Steve's first legal victory, granting him temporary custody of 3 children he couldn't produce. The irony was delicious, but the practical implications were serious. Every day, Jean remained hidden, strengthened Steve's claims that she was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. But every day also gave Helen and Catalina more opportunities to document Steve's true nature. The recordings from this week are incredible, Jean said, switching to audio files Catalina had captured. Listen to this one from Tuesday. Steve's voice filled the basement through expensive speakers, his words dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that revealed his true character. I don't care what it costs. Find them. And when you do, I want Jean discredited completely. Medical records, psychiatric evaluations, anything that proves she's unfit. I want custody so airtight she never sees those babies again without my permission. Catalina's voice responded with the perfect mix of supportive girlfriend and secret recording device. What about her mother? Elena Cooper is a federal judge. She might have helped Jean disappear. Elena Cooper is a retired federal judge, Steve corrected, and judges make enemies. I'm sure we can find something in her past that discredits any testimony she might give. The recording continued for 23 minutes, during which Steve outlined a strategy that went far beyond winning custody. He wanted to destroy Johnny's reputation, eliminate her support system, and ensure she was completely isolated before he moved to the next phase of his plan. He's talking about having you committed, Elena said grimly, after listening to the full recording. Involuntary psychiatric hold based on postpartum psychosis. He's already consulted with Dr. Patricia Hawthorne about the procedures. Dr. Hawthorne, the forensic psychologist Steve had been planning to use for months. But Helen's investigation had revealed something Steve didn't know. Dr. Hawthorne was currently under investigation by the State Medical Board for falsifying psychiatric evaluations in custody cases. Her professional opinion could be bought for the right price, and Steve had apparently been willing to pay it. We have her bank records, Jan said, pulling up financial documents. 3 payments from Steve's shell company over the past 2 months. He's been paying for a predetermined diagnosis. The evidence mountain had grown beyond anything they'd initially imagined. What had started as documentation of adultery had become a federal case involving wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Helen had created a detailed timeline showing 8 years of Steve's predatory behavior, with supporting evidence from his victims and documentation of his escalating crimes. But the crown jewel of their evidence was something Steve had never suspected. Catalina's pregnancy wasn't accidental. Show me the fertility clinic records again, Elena requested. Jean pulled up medical documents that told a chilling story. Steve had been secretly monitoring Catalina's ovulation cycle, timing their encounters to maximize the chances of pregnancy, while telling her he was taking precautions. He'd wanted her pregnant as leverage in case Jean proved more difficult to handle than expected. Two pregnant women, both carrying his children, both positioned as weapons in his war for complete control. He's done this before, John realized, cross-referencing the timeline with Maria Santos's medical records. Maria got pregnant at exactly the wrong time for Steve, right when John was starting fertility treatments. So he discarded Maria and kept John for the IVF babies. The pattern was clear once all the evidence was assembled. Steve collected pregnant women like trophies, but he only kept the ones who served his current needs. When the women became inconvenient or demanded too much, he destroyed them systematically and moved on to the next victim. Catalina's recording equipment arrived today, Helen announced, joining them in the basement war room. Professional grade, completely undetectable. She'll be able to capture every conversation without Steve suspecting anything. Catalina's transformation from mistress to double agent had been remarkable. Helen had spent hours training her in investigation techniques, teaching her how to ask leading questions and extract admissions without arousing suspicion. The woman who'd once been Steve's willing accomplice was now his most dangerous enemy. She's also agreed to testify before the grand jury, Helen continued. Full immunity in exchange for cooperation. The federal prosecutor is very interested in Steve's financial crimes. Federal charges. The local custody battle had evolved into a federal criminal case that could put Steve in prison for decades. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and what the prosecutor was calling systematic criminal harassment, based on his pattern of destroying women who trusted him. "When do we make our move?" Jean asked, adjusting Emberly against her shoulder. "One more week," Helen replied. "Steve's getting desperate enough to make major mistakes, and Catalina needs time to gather the final pieces of evidence. We want everything documented before we reveal our hand. One more week of hiding. One more week of watching Steve's public relations disaster unfold as the media questioned why a loving husband's pregnant wife would disappear rather than trust him with their children's safety. One more week of letting him dig his own grave deeper with every increasingly desperate action. The basement monitors showed local news coverage of Steve's latest press conference, where he'd appeared with his law partner to request public assistance in finding his missing family. The performance had been polished but unconvincing. A successful lawyer who couldn't explain why his wife was so afraid of him that she'd chosen to become a fugitive rather than trust the legal system. Social media had been brutal. Whereas Jean was trending, but not in the way Steve had intended. Instead of sympathy for a worried husband, the hashtag was filled with speculation about what kind of man drives his pregnant wife to disappear with their newborn children. "The court of public opinion has already convicted him," Elena observed, scrolling through Twitter responses to Steve's press conference. "Look at these comments. If my husband made me feel unsafe enough to run away with my babies, there's a reason. Something's wrong with this story. Loving husbands don't lose their families. Has anyone investigated him? Missing wife usually means guilty husband." Steve's carefully constructed image as the concerned father was crumbling under public scrutiny. His law firm's clients were asking uncomfortable questions. His business partners were distancing themselves from the controversy. Even his golf club membership was reportedly under review. But Steve's professional destruction was just the appetizer. The main course would be federal prison, and dessert would be watching him lose his children forever, while Jean built a beautiful new life without him. "Catalina sent this today," Helen said, handing Jean a printed transcript. Steve's conversation with his lawyer about permanent solutions to his problems. The transcript was chilling. Steve had moved beyond legal strategies into discussions of having both John and Catalina eliminated after Catalina gave birth, so he could take all 4 children and start fresh somewhere else. "He's talking about murder for hire," Elena said quietly, reading over John's shoulder. "And he thinks Catalina is completely loyal to him." It was the final piece of evidence they needed to prove Steve wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a dangerous predator willing to kill the mothers of his children to maintain complete control. He crossed the line from infidelity to conspiracy to commit kidnapping, Jean realized, and he documented it all himself. The irony was perfect. Steve's compulsive need to control every detail of his schemes had created a paper trail that would destroy him completely. Every email, every recorded conversation, every financial transaction was evidence of his criminal enterprise. "One more week," John whispered to Emberly, who was finally falling asleep in her arms. "One more week, and Mama's going to make sure your father never hurts another woman again." The evidence mountain was complete. The federal case was airtight. Steve's destruction was inevitable. Now they just had to time the avalanche perfectly. In 7 days, Steve Hicks would discover what happened when you tried to destroy a woman who was smarter, more strategic, and infinitely more patient than you'd ever imagined. The war was almost over, and John was about to win everything. Chapter 7. Minutes before checkmate. The white limousine pulled up to the Cook County Courthouse at exactly 9:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Steve Hicks was scheduled to receive emergency custody of 3 children he'd never held, never fed, never seen outside of surveillance photos. Inside the courthouse, Steve stood before Judge Morrison with the assurance of a man who believed victory was inevitable. His $1,000 suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair immaculately styled, and his expression conveyed concerned fatherhood finally getting justice after weeks of unexplained suffering. "Your Honor," Steve's lawyer, Marcus Webb, was saying, "my client has endured 4 weeks of psychological torture, not knowing if his newborn daughters are safe, healthy, or even alive. Mrs. Cooper Hicks's disappearance demonstrates a level of mental instability that makes her unfit for custody of vulnerable infants." Steve nodded gravely, playing the role of the victimized husband perfectly. Behind him, Catalina sat in the gallery, wearing a conservative black dress and an expression of supportive concern. To any observer, she looked like a loyal friend offering moral support during a family crisis. None of them knew she was wearing a wire. "The evidence clearly shows a pattern of erratic behavior," Webb continued, gesturing to a thick folder of fabricated documentation. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks has a family history of mental illness, demonstrated paranoid thinking during her pregnancy, and ultimately committed what amounts to kidnapping by disappearing with the children." Judge Morrison, a gray-haired man with a reputation for quick decisions and conservative family values, seemed receptive to the argument. Steve had chosen his venue carefully. Morrison was known for favoring fathers in custody disputes and had little patience for what he called hysterical female behavior. "Has there been any contact from Mrs. Cooper Hicks?" the judge asked. "None, Your Honor," Steve replied, allowing just the right amount of pain to color his voice. "I've tried everything, phone calls, emails, even reaching out through mutual friends. It's as if she's vanished completely. I'm terrified something has happened to my daughters." The performance was flawless. Steve had always been an excellent actor, capable of projecting whatever emotion served his purposes. Today he was the grieving father, the worried husband, the victim of a woman's mental breakdown. But outside the courthouse, Jonna Cooper Hicks was making final preparations for the performance of her lifetime. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked for the 5th time, adjusting the baby carrier that held Thessaly. "Once we walk through those doors, there's no going back." Jane stood beside the limousine, holding Lyra Lay, while a security guard held Emberly. She wore a white dress that fit her perfectly, not the shapeless maternity clothes Steve was used to seeing, but an elegant sheath that showcased her post-pregnancy figure and made her look like a queen returning from exile. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup flawless, and her expression was serene in a way that suggested complete confidence in the outcome of the day's events. She looked nothing like the broken, mentally unstable woman Steve had described to the court. "Mama, I've been preparing for this moment for 4 weeks," Jean said quietly. "Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every financial record, it's all waiting for the right moment. And that moment is now." Helen Morrison stood nearby, speaking quietly into a phone with federal agents who were positioned strategically around the courthouse. The FBI had been remarkably cooperative once they'd reviewed the evidence of Steve's financial crimes and systematic harassment of vulnerable women. "Agent Rodriguez confirms they're ready," Helen reported. "The moment Steve walks out of that courthouse with his victory, he'll be arrested on federal charges." But the arrest was just the beginning. Jean's real victory would be watching Steve's entire world collapse in real time as the truth about his crimes became public knowledge. "Remember," Jean said to her team, "this isn't about revenge. This is about justice. And it's about making sure Steve never has the opportunity to destroy another woman or child." At 9:52 a.m., they began their walk toward the courthouse entrance. The effect was immediate and electric. Reporters who'd been covering Steve's missing family story for weeks suddenly scrambled for better camera angles as they recognized Jean Cooper Hicks walking confidently toward the building, carrying one baby while clearly accompanied by two more. "There she is," someone shouted. "Jean Cooper Hicks is here." The crowd gathered outside the courthouse surged forward, cameras clicking and video rolling as the woman who'd been missing for 4 weeks made her triumphant return. She didn't look like a fugitive or a mentally unstable mother. She looked like a woman who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal the truth. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks," a reporter called out. "Where have you been? Are the babies safe?" Jeanne paused at the courthouse steps, turning to face the cameras with the kind of composed grace that suggested she'd been expecting this moment. "My daughters are perfectly safe," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "They've been with their mother where they belong, while I gathered evidence to protect them from a man who planned to steal them from me." The implications of her words sent a shock wave through the gathered media. Steve's narrative of a mentally unstable wife who'd kidnapped his children was crumbling in real time, replaced by the suggestion that Jean had been protecting her daughters from their own father. "Evidence of what?" another reporter demanded. Jean smiled with the confidence of a woman holding winning cards in a game her opponent didn't even know he was playing. "Evidence that will be presented to federal prosecutors very shortly," she replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a custody hearing to attend." Inside the courthouse, the hearing was proceeding exactly as Steve had planned. Judge Morrison was reviewing the emergency custody documents when a bailiff approached the bench. "Your Honor," the bailiff whispered, "there's been a development. Mrs. Cooper Hicks has arrived with the children." The words hit Steve like a physical blow. His carefully constructed narrative required Jean to remain missing, allowing him to claim custody by default. Her appearance with 3 healthy babies destroyed his claims about her mental instability and potential harm to the children. "What?" Steve said, his composure cracking for the first time in weeks. Judge Morrison looked up from his papers with obvious surprise. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks is here." The courtroom doors opened, and Jean entered with the kind of dramatic timing that would be remembered for years. She walked slowly down the center aisle, holding Lyrelay, while Elena and a security guard followed with Emberly and Thessaly. The effect on Steve was immediate and devastating. His face went white as he saw his daughters for the first time. 3 beautiful babies who clearly showed no signs of abuse, neglect, or any harm whatsoever. They were healthy, alert, and obviously well cared for by the woman he'd claimed was too mentally unstable to function as a mother. "Your Honor," Jean said as she approached the bench, "I apologize for my absence from these proceedings. I've been protecting my daughters while gathering evidence of my husband's plan to steal them from me through fraudulent custody claims." The words landed in the courtroom like grenades. Steve's lawyer jumped to his feet, but before he could object, Jean continued. "I have extensive documentation of Mr. Hicks's systematic deception, financial fraud, and conspiracy to have me declared mentally incompetent based on fabricated evidence. I'm prepared to present this evidence to the court immediately." Judge Morrison looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. The confident narrative he'd been hearing from Steve's legal team was clearly more complicated than they'd presented. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks," he said carefully, "you've been missing for 4 weeks with 3 newborn children. Before we can address custody, this court needs to understand why you disappeared and verify the children's well-being." "Your Honor," Jean replied calmly, "I've been protecting my children while documenting my husband's criminal activity. Detective Torres from Chicago PD can speak to the ongoing investigation." As if summoned by those words, Detective Ramon Torres walked into the courtroom with the measured pace of a veteran police officer who'd seen too many domestic cases turn deadly. Behind him, Catalina shifted in her seat, and Steve suddenly realized that his pregnant mistress was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not love or support, but something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "Catalina," he whispered, turning in his chair. She met his eyes and smiled with the same cold confidence Jean was displaying. "Hello, Steve," she said quietly. "Enjoying your big victory?" In that moment, Steve Hicks realized that everything he thought he knew about the past 4 weeks was wrong. The custody hearing he'd arranged wasn't his triumph, it was his trap. The woman he'd been sleeping with wasn't his ally, she was his betrayer. And the wife he'd thought he was outsmarting wasn't a victim, she was a predator who'd been hunting him while he celebrated his anticipated victory. "Your Honor," Steve's lawyer said desperately, "I need a moment to confer with my client." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Detective Torres said from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see the veteran detective walking down the aisle with 2 uniformed officers, their presence grimly professional. "Stephen Hicks," Detective Torres announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, harassment, violation of restraining order, and conspiracy to commit witness tampering." The courtroom erupted into chaos as reporters realized they were witnessing not just a custody hearing, but the arrest of a prominent Chicago lawyer on serious criminal charges. Steve sat frozen in his chair, his mind struggling to process how his moment of triumph had become his moment of complete destruction. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent continued, moving toward Steve with handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Steve's eyes found Jean, who was standing calmly beside the judge's bench, still holding Lirelay, watching his arrest with the serene expression of a woman who'd planned every moment of his downfall. "How?" he whispered. Jean stepped closer, her voice too quiet for the cameras to pick up, but loud enough for Steve to hear clearly. "You made one mistake, Steve," she said softly. "You assumed I was just another victim you could destroy. But I'm not Maria Santos or Rebecca Walsh or any of the other women whose lives you've ruined. I'm Jean Cooper Hicks, and I'm the woman who's going to make sure you never hurt anyone ever again." As the handcuffs clicked around Steve's wrists, Jean felt Lirelai stir in her arms. Her daughter opened her dark eyes, eyes that looked exactly like her father's but held none of his cruelty, and seemed to study the scene around her with infant curiosity. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jean whispered to her daughter. The bad man can't hurt us anymore. Steve was led away in handcuffs as cameras rolled and reporters shouted questions. His perfect plan had become his perfect destruction, orchestrated by the woman he'd underestimated completely. The war was over, and Jean had won everything. Chapter 8. The First Blood. The courthouse steps had become a media circus within minutes of Steve Hicks's arrest. News vans lined the street, reporters jostled for position, and social media exploded with footage of the prominent Chicago lawyer being led away in handcuffs while his wife stood calmly holding their newborn daughter. For Jean Cooper Hicks, standing in the chaos with Lyra Lay in her arms, the moment felt surreal, like watching someone else's victory unfold in slow motion. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks," reporters shouted from every direction, "can you comment on your husband's arrest? What evidence do you have against him? Where have you been for the past 4 weeks? Are the babies safe?" Jean raised one hand and the crowd quieted with the kind of respect usually reserved for heads of state. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the courthouse steps without her needing to shout. "My daughters and I have been in protective custody while federal investigators built their case against Stephen Hicks," she said. "The evidence will speak for itself in court, but I can tell you that my children are safe, healthy, and will never be in danger from their father again." The implications hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Behind the camera lenses and microphones, Jeanne could see the questions forming. What kind of danger? What evidence? How long had this investigation been going on? "I'll be giving a full statement later today," Jeanne continued. "For now, I want to thank the federal investigators who took my concerns seriously, and I want other women in similar situations to know that justice is possible." Other women. The phrase sent a ripple through the crowd as reporters began to understand that Steve's case might involve more than financial crimes or a custody dispute. Agent Rodriguez appeared at Gian's elbow, his presence both protective and professionally courteous. "Ma'am, we should move you and the children to a more secure location." Jean nodded, but before turning to leave, she caught sight of Catalina Morales standing near the courthouse entrance. Steve's former mistress looked pale but determined, wearing the same conservative black dress she'd worn to support Steve in court an hour earlier. Now she was waiting to give testimony that would help destroy him. Their eyes met across the chaos, and Catalina walked over with the careful steps of a woman walking through a minefield of cameras and questions. "Jean," Catalina said quietly when she was close enough to speak without being overheard, "I want you to know how sorry I am. About everything." The moment was caught by dozens of cameras, but the audio would be impossible to pick up over the crowd noise. To outside observers, it looked like a tense confrontation between a wife and her husband's mistress. Only Jean and Catalina knew it was something else entirely. "You helped save my daughters," Jean replied simply. "That matters more than anything that came before." Catalina's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Jean had seen from her since this whole nightmare began. "He was going to destroy me too," Catalina whispered. "Just like the others. I was so stupid to believe him." "You weren't stupid," Jean said firmly. "You were his victim, but you chose to be a survivor instead." Agent Rodriguez was becoming impatient with the extended conversation in front of so many cameras. "Ladies, we really need to move." As they walked toward the waiting federal vehicles, Jean heard her phone buzzing constantly with calls and texts. The news of Steve's arrest was spreading through Chicago's legal and social communities like wildfire, and everyone wanted information, confirmation, or simply to distance themselves from the scandal. One text from Steve's law partner, Daniel Morrison, caught her attention. "Jean, please call me immediately. We need to discuss the firm's position on Steve's situation." The firm's position? Already, Steve's business partners were preparing to throw him under the bus to protect themselves. Within hours, there would be statements about how shocked they were, how they'd had no knowledge of his criminal activities, how they were cooperating fully with federal investigators. But Jane knew better. Helen's investigation had uncovered communications between Steve and his partners that suggested they'd at least suspected his financial irregularities. Whether they'd face charges themselves remained to be seen. The building where they were taken for debriefing was Chicago PD's downtown headquarters. Detective Torres led them through security checkpoints and down long hallways to a conference room that felt like a war room. Whiteboards covered with evidence charts, boxes of documents, and multiple computer screens displaying financial records and communication logs. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks," Detective Torres said once they were seated, "what you and your team accomplished is remarkable. The evidence you've provided has given us one of the most comprehensive domestic fraud cases we've seen in years." Helen Morrison, who'd arrived separately to avoid being photographed with John, was already in the room organizing files and preparing for what she called the victory lap briefing. "The financial crimes alone will put Steve away for 10 to 15 years, Helen reported. But when you add the conspiracy charges and the recorded confessions, we're looking at life in prison. A life sentence. Steve Hicks would die in prison, never to threaten another woman or child again." "What about his other victims?" John asked, thinking about Maria Santos, Rebecca Walsh, and the other women Steve had destroyed. "Will they get justice too?" "Maria Santos is prepared to testify about Steve's harassment and the circumstances of her miscarriage," Detective Torres replied. "Rebecca Walsh's family is cooperating with our investigation into the circumstances of her death, and we've identified 3 other women who are willing to provide testimony about Steve's pattern of behavior." Pattern of behavior. The clinical phrase didn't capture the human cost of Steve's crimes, the broken lives, destroyed careers, and shattered trust that followed in his wake. But it would be enough to ensure he never hurt anyone again. "There's something else," Helen added, pulling out a thick folder. "Steve's been in contact with someone while he's been in custody, someone who might complicate our timeline." Jean felt a chill of concern. Who? Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, the forensic psychologist he'd been paying for false diagnoses. "She's agreed to testify that you showed signs of mental instability during your pregnancy in exchange for immunity from prosecution." The news hit Jean like a physical blow. Even from jail, Steve was still trying to destroy her credibility and claim custody of their daughters. "Can she do that?" Elena asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "Can she give testimony based on fabricated evaluations?" "She can try," Agent Rodriguez replied, "but Dr. Hawthorne is currently under investigation by the State Medical Board for exactly this kind of behavior. Her credibility is questionable at best." "Plus," Helen added with a smile that suggested she had more cards to play, "we have recordings of Steve paying her for predetermined diagnoses. Her testimony will only strengthen our conspiracy case." Even Steve's desperate attempts to salvage his situation were making their case stronger. Every move he made from jail was being monitored and recorded, providing additional evidence of his willingness to commit crimes to maintain control. "What happens next?" Jean asked, adjusting Emberly in her arms as the baby began to fuss. "Steve will be arraigned tomorrow morning," Detective Torres explained. "His lawyer will probably ask for bail, but given the seriousness of the charges and flight risk, we expect he'll be held without bond." Held without bond. Steve would remain in custody until trial, which could take months or even years to conclude. During that time, Jeanne would be free to rebuild her life with her daughters, knowing that their father could never threaten them again. "There's going to be a media frenzy," Helen warned. "Steve's arrest is already national news, and when the details of his crimes become public, it's going to get much worse." John had been prepared for this. Steve's destruction would be public and humiliating, which was exactly what he deserved after the public humiliation he'd planned for her. "Let them come," she said calmly. "I have nothing to hide anymore." As if summoned by her words, Jean's phone began ringing with calls from reporters, magazine editors, and television producers. The story of the missing pregnant wife who'd outmaneuvered her criminal husband was exactly the kind of narrative that captured public attention. "There's one more thing," Agent Rodriguez said, his expression becoming more serious. "We've recovered communications between Steve and an associate that suggest he was planning more than just financial fraud and custody manipulation." The room went quiet except for the soft sounds of the babies. "What kind of communications?" Elena asked. "References to permanent solutions and eliminating complications," the agent replied. "We're still analyzing them, but there's a possibility Steve was planning to have you physically harmed." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Steve hadn't just been planning to steal Jan's children and destroy her reputation. He'd been considering having her killed. "My God," Elena whispered. But Jan felt something other than fear. She felt validation for every moment of paranoia, every careful precaution, every decision to trust her instincts over Steve's reassurances. "That's why I disappeared," she said quietly. "Some part of me knew he was dangerous, even if I couldn't prove it yet." "Your instincts saved your life," Helen agreed, "and probably your daughter's lives too." Detective Torres closed his folder and stood up. "Mrs. Cooper Hicks, you should know that your case is going to change how we investigate domestic crimes involving powerful men. The evidence you gathered and the way you built your case, it's going to be studied and replicated." As they prepared to leave the federal building, Jean took a moment to look around the conference room where Steve's crimes had been laid bare and his fate sealed. Whiteboards covered with evidence, boxes of documents proving his guilt, computer screens displaying the money trail that would send him to prison forever. All of it gathered by a woman he'd dismissed as emotionally unstable and intellectually inferior. "Thank you," she said to Detective Torres and Helen, "for believing me, for helping me protect my daughters." "Thank you," Detective Torres replied, "for having the courage to fight back." Outside, the media circus was growing larger as news networks picked up the story. But John no longer felt intimidated by the attention. She'd spent 4 weeks hiding in fear of Steve's power and influence. Now Steve was the one hiding, behind lawyers and federal marshals, facing a lifetime in prison for crimes he'd committed with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. The first blood had been drawn. Steve's arrest and the initial revelations of his crimes were just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the full scope of his destruction, and the world would learn exactly what kind of monster had been masquerading as a successful Chicago lawyer. But tonight, Jean Cooper Hicks would sleep peacefully for the first time in months, holding her daughters close and knowing they were finally, truly safe. Chapter 9. The Trap Titans. 4 months after his arrest, Steve Hicks walked out of the Cook County Correctional Facility, a free man, temporarily. His $500,000 bail had been posted by business associates who believed in his innocence. His high-powered legal team had successfully gotten charges reduced while they reviewed extensive material, and his carefully orchestrated media campaign had begun shifting public opinion in his favor. To anyone watching the news, Steve Hicks appeared to be a successful businessman, wrongfully accused by a vindictive ex-wife who'd orchestrated an elaborate frame job to destroy him in their custody battle. "Mr. Hicks," reporters called out as he emerged from the facility in a perfectly tailored Navy suit, looking every inch the successful attorney rather than a man who'd spent 6 months in federal custody. "How does it feel to be free?" Steve paused at the top of the courthouse steps, his expression conveying exactly the right mixture of relief and righteous indignation. "It feels like justice delayed, but not denied," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had made him one of Chicago's most successful lawyers. "I've always maintained my innocence, and I'm confident that when all the facts come to light, I'll be completely vindicated." Behind him, his new legal team, led by the notorious criminal defense attorney Victoria Sterling, nodded approvingly. Sterling was known for her ability to get wealthy criminals acquitted on technicalities, and her presence at Steve's side sent a clear message. He was fighting back with unlimited resources and no intention of going quietly to prison. "Mr. Hicks," another reporter called out, "what's your response to the criminal charges related to fraud and conspiracy?" Steve's expression hardened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "Those charges are based on fabricated evidence and false testimony from people with financial motives to lie. My legal team will prove my innocence completely." The performance was masterful. Steve had spent 6 months in custody, crafting this narrative with the help of a public relations firm that specialized in reputation rehabilitation. Every word was calculated to make him appear sympathetic while casting doubt on John's credibility. "As for the other allegations," he continued, "they are fabrications created by women seeking to profit from false accusations against a successful man. My legal team will be filing defamation suits against each of them." Defamation suits. Steve was going on the offensive, using his legal expertise to intimidate his victims into silence while positioning himself as the real victim of a coordinated conspiracy. The strategy was working. Social media buzzed with number justice for Steve hashtags. Legal experts appeared on television questioning the strength of the prosecution's case. 3 of Steve's former victims had already recanted their statements after receiving legal threats from his attorneys. But the crown jewel of Steve's rehabilitation campaign was standing beside him as he addressed the media: Catalina Morales, now visibly pregnant and wearing an engagement ring that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. "I stand by Stephen completely," Catalina said when a reporter directed a question her way. "The man I know is kind, generous, and devoted to his children. I believe he was framed by people who wanted to destroy him." The transformation was remarkable. The woman who'd helped federal investigators build their case against Steve was now his most vocal defender, claiming she'd been coerced into providing false testimony by overzealous prosecutors who'd threatened her with prosecution if she didn't cooperate. "Ms. Morales," a reporter pressed, "you previously testified that Mr. Hicks had manipulated you and other women. What changed your mind?" Catalina's smile was perfect, just the right mixture of sadness and conviction. "I was young and scared, and I let them convince me that lies were truth. Stephen never manipulated me. He loved me, and he loves our child. Everything I said before was because I was afraid of going to prison myself." The recantation had been a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Without Catalina's testimony, prosecutors had lost their most compelling witness to Steve's pattern of predatory behavior. Other women had followed her lead, claiming they'd been pressured into making false statements. One by one, Steve's accusers were disappearing or changing their stories. "What about your daughters?" another reporter asked. "Do you plan to seek custody?" For the first time, Steve's composed mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of the cold determination that had driven him to commit his crimes. "My daughters are being raised by a woman who kidnapped them and kept them from their father for months," he said. "Of course I'm seeking custody. Every child deserves to be with the parent who can provide the most stable, loving home." The statement was a direct threat to Jean, delivered with the confidence of a man who believed he was winning. And according to every objective measure, Steve was winning. His business was thriving. New clients who admired his resilience in the face of false accusations had actually increased his revenue. His reputation was being systematically rehabilitated by the best public relations firm money could buy. His legal team was confident they could get the charges dismissed on procedural grounds. Most importantly, his private investigators had finally located Jean's safe house. The surveillance photos confirm it. Marcus Webb, Steve's lead attorney, had told him during their strategy meeting that morning. She's living under an assumed name in Riverside, about 40 miles from the city. 3 children, 1 adult female who matches her mother's description. Steve had smiled with satisfaction as he reviewed the photos of John pushing a stroller through a suburban park, looking like any other single mother going about her daily routine. She'd lost the polished sophistication that had once made her a power player in Chicago's investment community. Now she looked ordinary, unremarkable, defeated. We can have process servers deliver custody documents within 24 hours, Webb had continued. The emergency court order gives you immediate visitation rights, and we can argue that her continued evasion of legal proceedings demonstrates ongoing mental instability. Perfect. Steve would use the legal system to force John out of hiding, then systematically destroy her credibility while positioning himself as the stable parent who deserved custody. But first, he had other business to attend to. "Thank you all for your support," Steve told the reporters, wrapping up his impromptu press conference. "I look forward to proving my innocence in court and reuniting with my daughters." As the media dispersed, Steve felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced since before Jean's disappearance. Everything was falling into place exactly as he'd planned. His enemies were retreating, his reputation was recovering, and his freedom was secure. He'd underestimated Jean once, allowing her to catch him off guard with her coordinated attack. He wouldn't make that mistake again. This time he was prepared for everything she might try. That evening, in the penthouse apartment his anonymous supporters had purchased for him, Steve celebrated his apparent victory with Catalina and his legal team. The apartment was even more luxurious than the home he'd shared with Jean. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, designer furniture, and every amenity money could buy. "To justice," Victoria Sterling said, raising her champagne glass in a toast. "To winning," Steve replied, his smile predatory. Catalina raised her glass of sparkling water, her expression serene. "To family," she added. The word hung in the air with special significance. In 4 months, Catalina would give birth to Steve's son, the male heir he'd always wanted. Combined with custody of his daughters, Steve would have the perfect family to showcase during his trial and beyond. "Have you given any more thought to my proposal?" Steve asked Victoria as the evening wound down. Victoria Sterling's proposal was ambitious. A countersuit against Jean, federal prosecutors, and every investigator involved in building the case against Steve. Abuse of process, prosecutorial misconduct, conspiracy to commit fraud. A legal assault that would bankrupt Jean and destroy the careers of everyone who'd participated in his prosecution. "The paperwork will be ready next week," Victoria confirmed. "We're seeking $50 million in damages, plus attorney fees and punitive damages that could easily reach another $20 million. $70 million. Even if they only won a fraction of that amount, it would be enough to ensure Jeanne could never afford to fight him again." "What about the women who recanted their testimony?" Steve asked. "They'll be star witnesses in our countersuit," Victoria replied. "Their testimony about prosecutorial coercion will be devastating to the federal case." Steve's phone buzzed with a text from one of his private investigators. "Target confirmed at residence, awaiting further instructions." Target. Steve's investigators had located not just Jean, but her support network. Elena Cooper's location, Helen Morrison's office, even the safe house where John had hidden for months. All of it was now under surveillance. "Gentlemen," Steve said, raising his glass one final time, "I believe we're about to demonstrate what happens when you try to destroy Stephen Hicks." The trap was tightening around Jean, and she had no idea what was coming. Steve had learned from his previous mistakes. This time he wouldn't underestimate his opponent. This time he wouldn't leave anything to chance. This time he would destroy Gene Cooper Hicks completely, and there would be no coming back from it. But as Steve savored his champagne and planned Gene's destruction, he remained blissfully unaware of one crucial fact. Catalina Morales had been recording every conversation, documenting every crime, and building a case that would destroy him completely. Steve Hicks thought he was winning. In reality, he was about to discover that the woman carrying his child had decided to save that child from having a murderer for a father, and his apparent victory was about to become the most devastating defeat of his life. Chapter 10. Nuclear Revenge. The reconciliation meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. at the Fairmont Hotel, neutral ground where Steve believed he would finally corner Jean into accepting his terms for custody and financial settlement. Steve arrived 20 minutes early, settling into the luxury suite he'd reserved for the occasion with the confidence of a general reviewing battle plans before an inevitable victory. 6 months of careful maneuvering had led to this moment. Jean's support system was crumbling, her legal team was overwhelmed by his countersuit, and his own rehabilitation was nearly complete. At 2:55 p.m., there was a soft knock on the suite door. "Come in," Steve called, standing to greet the woman he'd once loved and was now preparing to destroy completely. But when the door opened, it wasn't Jean who entered. Detective Torres stepped into the room, followed by 2 uniformed officers. "Stephen Hicks," Torres announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd waited months for this moment. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violation of restraining order, witness tampering, and solicitation of criminal activity." Steve's face went white as handcuffs clicked around his wrists for the second time in 8 months. "What? This is impossible. I haven't violated any conditions." "Mr. Hicks," Agent Rodriguez said with obvious pleasure, "you've been under surveillance every moment since your release. Every phone call recorded, every financial transaction monitored, every meeting documented." As if summoned by those words, Jean Cooper Hicks walked into the hotel suite with the serene confidence of a woman who'd just won the most important battle of her life. She looked magnificent. Gone was the exhausted new mother hiding in safe houses. This was the investment analyst who'd built million-dollar portfolios, the strategic mind who'd outmaneuvered Chicago's most cunning lawyer, the woman who'd spent 8 months planning the most elaborate revenge in legal history. "Hello, Steve," she said quietly. "Enjoying your freedom." Steve's mind reeled as he tried to process what was happening. "John, what is this? What's going on?" "This," John said, settling gracefully into one of the suite's expensive chairs, "is what happens when you threaten the wrong woman's children." Torres pulled out a folder and began reading charges that would ensure Steve never threatened another woman again. But Jean held up one hand, stopping him. "Actually, Detective Torres, I think Steve deserves to understand exactly how we caught him." She opened her own folder, leather-bound and organized with the precision that had made her one of Chicago's most successful analysts. "You see, Steve, when you got out on bail, you made a critical mistake. You thought you'd won. You got careless." "What mistake?" Steve whispered. "You trusted Catalina. You told her about your plans to eliminate me, to have her killed after the baby was born, to steal all the children and start fresh, somewhere else." Jean turned a page in her folder, revealing photographs that made Steve's blood freeze. "But Catalina isn't the naive young woman you thought you could manipulate forever. When Helen Morrison showed her what happened to your other victims, she realized she was next on your list. So she came to us," Torres added, "agreed to wear a wire to get you to confess to your crimes on tape." The words hit Steve like physical blows. His freedom, his luxury apartment, his expensive legal team, all of it funded by the very people trying to destroy him. "That's impossible," he whispered. The penthouse apartment you're so proud of. FBI surveillance center. Every room monitored, every conversation recorded. The private investigators you hired to find me. Federal agents documenting your violation of restraining orders and anti-stalking laws. Jean turned a page in her folder, revealing photographs that made Steve's blood freeze. Your new business clients who've been so supportive during your legal troubles. All federal agents running sting operations. Every case you've handled, every piece of legal advice you've given, every financial transaction, all recorded as evidence. Steve sank into a chair as the magnitude of his situation became clear. But Catalina, she came back to me. She recanted her testimony. Jean's smile was devastating in its cold beauty. Oh, Steve. Sweet, naive Steve. Did you really think Catalina came back because she loved you? As if summoned by her name, Catalina Morales walked into the hotel suite. But this wasn't the devoted fiancée who'd been supporting Steve publicly for 6 months. This was a woman wearing a wire, carrying recording equipment, and wearing the confident expression of someone who'd just helped catch a dangerous criminal. "Hello, Steve," she said, showing the recording device she'd been wearing. "Did you enjoy planning my murder, too?" Steve's world tilted off its axis. "What?" "I've been recording you for 3 months, Steve," Catalina said, her voice carrying none of the submissive sweetness he'd grown accustomed to. "Every threat, every plan, every crime you thought you were committing in private." She placed a recording device on the hotel suite's coffee table, "including your plan to have me accidentally killed after I gave birth so you could raise our son without the inconvenience of his mother." Steve's hands shook as he realized the scope of his situation. "But you're pregnant. Our baby." "Our baby deserves better than a father who's a murderer," Catalina replied firmly. "That's why I'm making sure you never get the chance to hurt another child." John stood up, moving to the suite's windows overlooking Lake Michigan. "You see, Steve, while you were celebrating your apparent victory, I was executing the most complex revenge plan in legal history." She turned back to face him, her expression serene. "Phase 1 was my disappearance. Successful. You showed your true nature trying to find me. Phase 2 was your arrest and initial charges. Successful. The world saw what kind of man drives his wife into hiding. Phase 3 was your apparent comeback. Successful. You revealed every criminal contact, every corrupt practice, every law you were willing to break. Phase 4, Jean said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of total victory, is your complete and permanent destruction." Agent Rodriguez opened his own folder, revealing surveillance photos, financial records, and recorded conversations that chronicled 8 months of Steve's criminal activity while on bail. "Conspiracy to commit witness tampering," he read. "You paid Maria Santos $50,000 to recant her testimony. Violation of federal racketeering statutes. You've been operating a criminal enterprise disguised as a law practice. Money laundering. The funds for your defense came from illegal offshore accounts you established with stolen client money. And finally," Agent Rodriguez said with obvious satisfaction, "conspiracy to commit murder." Steve's face went ashen. "That's impossible. I never—" The recording device on the table began playing Steve's own voice from their meeting the previous week. "I need them both gone, Catalina. Jean and you. After the baby's born. Clean. No connections back to me. Then I take all the kids and disappear. New identity. New life." "But Steve," Catalina's recorded voice responded, "I thought we were going to be together." "Don't be naive," Steve's voice replied coldly. "You're a liability, just like she is. The only difference is timing." The recording continued with Steve detailing his plans to have both women killed and take all 4 children to live abroad under false identities. Conspiracy to commit murder, Torres said quietly, carries a life sentence in Illinois. Steve slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his moment of triumph had become his final downfall. How? He whispered. Simple, John replied. You thought you could manipulate everyone around you, use your charm and money to escape consequences. But you made one fatal mistake. What mistake? Steve asked, his voice barely audible. You tried to destroy a mother who loved her children more than she feared you. The recording stopped, leaving the hotel suite in absolute silence. Conspiracy to commit murder, Agent Rodriguez said quietly, carries a mandatory life sentence without possibility of parole. Steve slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his entire world had been an elaborate FBI sting operation designed to give him enough rope to hang himself. How? He whispered. Simple, Jean replied. I gave the FBI everything they needed to destroy you, then sat back and watched you destroy yourself. She moved to stand directly in front of him, looking down at the man who'd once been her husband. You thought you were so smart, Steve. You thought you could manipulate everyone around you, use your charm and money to escape consequences for your crimes. But you made one fatal mistake. What mistake? Steve asked, his voice barely audible. You tried to destroy a woman who was smarter than you, more patient than you, and who loved her children more than you loved yourself. Jean knelt down so she was at eye level with Steve, her voice soft but deadly. I spent 10 months planning your destruction while you spent 6 months walking deeper into my trap. Every move you made, every crime you committed, every law you broke, all exactly what I needed you to do. She stood up, smoothing her dress with casual elegance. My daughters will grow up knowing their father was a criminal who tried to murder their mother. They'll never wonder why Mama had to protect them from Daddy. And they'll never, ever have to see you again. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with the handcuffs. Stephen Hicks, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal racketeering statutes, money laundering, witness tampering, and violation of federal bail conditions. You have the right to remain silent. As the officers led Steve away in handcuffs for the final time, Jean remained in the hotel suite, looking out at Lake Michigan where she'd once dreamed of building a life with the man she'd loved. That man was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. But Jean Cooper Hicks remained, stronger, wiser, and completely free. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. How did it go? Jean smiled as she typed her response. Steve will spend his life in prison. The girls are safe forever. Justice is complete. Outside, Chicago sparkled in the afternoon sun, full of possibilities for a woman who'd just won the most important battle of her life. John A. Cooper Hicks walked out of the hotel suite and into her new beginning, leaving Stephen Hicks's story to end where it belonged, behind bars. The war was over, love had conquered evil, and the Queen had achieved perfect revenge.